Alright guys, it's been a while since I did a video, but this one we're going to do some basic 3D modeling and we're going to be making just kind of random shapes and stuff that you might find when doing maybe like furniture and things like that. This is geared towards beginners, but not necessarily like the basics like moving around and stuff like that. I'll talk about what I'm using as we go throughout this, and just keep in mind screencast keys doesn't usually work with mine, so instead I got machine tools display operators displayed in the bottom left here. So also keep this in mind that I hear a lot of beginners say, "Hey, I don't need add-ons. I want to learn vanilla Blender." That's fine. I understand the sentiment there. That's the way I started Blender. But machine tools, I highly recommend downloading it. It's free. There's a free version. There's a paid version. There's some other add-ons such as like Mesh Machine, which are paid versions, paid add-ons that really help you out a lot as well, including Hard Ops, Box Cutter, among other things. And I know it's a lot more to digest. You have to learn all these additional tools, but they're needed because in Maya and 3D Studio Max, you have certain little features that pop up in the workflows there, and Blender, native Blender doesn't have them. Okay, you have to have these add-ons to kind of use some of them. All right. With that in mind, I've already got a bunch of things configured for Blender. I just want to talk about add-ons that come with it that can be quite useful. So we're just going to take a look here real quick. You might want to use Bool tools if you're going to do a Boolean workflow. This is extremely useful. Okay, you can turn it on. You can display as a wireframe or not. That's up to you. But also loop tools is extremely useful. Maybe node wrangler and things like that. We're not going to get into textures, UV mapping, or materials here, but we're just going to play around with some basic shapes. All right. And I'll try not to use Mesh Machine or Box Cutter or Hard Ops. Just we'll keep with machine tools. That's it. And I won't use any of the Deus Ex version. There's a paid version of it that has a couple additional features that are really useful. But anyways, let's just jump into this. So hopefully you know how to move things around with like the G, R, and S key, right? You can hit G, X, G, Y, G, Z, all that fun stuff. S to scale, S, X, X, Y, S, Z, Shift Z, right? That kind of fun stuff. Keep in mind I'm going to be using a lot of selection methods in edit mode. So when you hit tab, control tab, you can get in and out of edit mode real quick. And I'm using the control tab is how you'll see that menu, but you can make it permanent as the tab key right here. So key map, tab for pie menu. All right, just keep that in mind. So we're in edit mode, basically. That's what we're doing. One, two, and three to select vertices, edges, faces. Okay. If you have machine tools installed, I do want to talk about this real quick. It's kind of a little bit of a problem add-on to enable. So basically, you download the zip file, you click install, you go to the zip file, and then you'll see that if you look for machine, that's Mesh Machine, machine tools right here. Okay. There's a couple things in here I do change. So I do want to point that out real quick. Under general, first of all, I have these options enabled um, by default. Well, I enabled them myself, but that's what I use. Under modes pie, there's a feature there. I've made a video past about it. It's the surface slide feature. So go check out the surface slide video if you can. I'll tell you how you can take the surface slide feature from the modes pie and put it onto your quick keys basically. And so I turn it off though. I don't like it actually. So the rest of this is configured kind of like so. The only thing I really change over here is I show volume snapping, show absolute grid snapping for the snapping pie, cursors and origin pie. I turn set transform preset when setting cursor off, and show cursor and selection to grid I turn on. Other than that, nothing here has really changed other than these are enabled. Right? Key maps, I do change these. By default, it's set to 1, 2, 4, and 3. Okay, so I set it to control 1, control 2, control 4, control 3, so I can get the smart face, merge last, and smart edge. And then I do disable the offset edge feature here, so just uncheck that. That's it. That's all I do to set up machine tools. Okay, and so anything in here is shift, or like you can use the shift and forward button on your mouse to get the snapping pie, shift back button, get to the pivot point and transform pie. All right, shift S becomes this, right? Selection the cursor pie or whatever, and then control S is this as well. Cool. So it's a good idea whenever you're creating something, save it somewhere. I'm going to just save to the desktop real quick. And I'll say this is object something. Type in O1. This can be quite useful because you can incrementally save. So every time you press that, you'll see that you get object O1, O2, right? Cool. So it'll incrementally save up. So if you ever mess up, you can always import something from a previous Blender file. It's very to do that, right? Now, I still have the ability to hit 1, 2, and 3 for my selections here, which is good. I have a couple additional hotkeys set up. Nothing real fancy here. I have like loops, edge rings, and all these things. I've set this up to work on my mouse, basically. Like loops, inner regions, boundary loops. Also have linked set up like so. This is, I'm using a macro of like shift number pad plus on my mouse, something like that. So it's all working on my mouse, basically. Right, so if you enable bool tools, you'll get a control shift. Try that again. Go back to object mode. Control shift B in object mode. You get the bool tools menu. Hard ops overrides a couple of these, but basically these would work with your mouse too if you set it up with control number pad minus or plus or whatever for the up and down, I guess, little on your left finger, basically those little buttons there. So it's like mouse number 3 and 4, I think, or something like that. So anyways, that's what that is. Also, if you're having a hard time navigating, tilde key, you can do view selected, things like that. Machine tools, the F key is the focus. Quick shortcut for focus there. One other thing is that when you're middle mouse clicking, right? If you hold Alt, you jump into side orthographic views. Basically, snap around like so. I'll do this kind of fast, but if you hold Alt down and then middle mouse click like you're gesturing, you can actually jump into those a little bit faster that way. That's something you might want to do as well. Just keep that in mind. Lots of selection methods, especially in edit mode for modifying your mesh. So you want to select like Alt Z, select rings. You can set it up to do something like that. Okay. Or you want to select loops or whatever the case. Boundary loops, right? Boundary loop. Cool stuff, right? Those are going to take you a lot farther. Just those shortcuts, setting those up. Also, quick favorites. You can pretty much on any menu, you can right click and assign a shortcut, or usually assign it to quick favorites as well. Depends on the thing, right? So, right shortcut, add to quick favorites. And when you assign something to quick favorites, you have to save your preferences if you're saving things manually. Okay. And so, with all that out of the way, let's get started here. We're going to do, I want to talk about game models and non-destructive workflows, Boolean workflows, but also subdivision surface modeling. All of this can come into play when creating game models. It's not so simple and straightforward, but one thing that I don't hear a lot of guys talk about is the fact that when you're making certain kinds of game models, like desks or chairs or things like that, you don't always need to make a high poly. A lot of times you can make just more or less your game object and just go for it. So like if this was a tabletop, you know, in edit mode, you just move it around the faces like so. Um, we're going to actually use the bevel modifier here. We're not going to use hard ops. The first time at least, I'll probably use it hard ops later on. But basically what it's going to do, hard ops anyways, is it's going to change the profile to something like 0.7, and it's going to turn the outer emitter type to arc, okay? And then that's pretty much it. You can play around with the offset. Some other little things might change as well, but you can see how this is working out. Let's look at something like so, all right? And so these can be quite useful. Make sure that's going to be the same result with hard ops here. So if you use the bevel modifier here, oh, no, it's not the same result right now. 3 segments, we had 1 segment. All right, so that's all that needed to change basically. And you can see here if we were to apply that bevel modifier again, we would have to change this every time to arc, and we would have to change the profile back to 0.7. 0.7 just happens to look nicer, generally speaking, for hard surface stuff, but you could use something else as well. So if we change this to 2, this is preferable. You want even numbers here with 2. We get a center edge, okay? And this is good for UV mapping, generally speaking. So you want 2, 4. You can see we got the center edge again. And this will allow us later on, if we were to apply this bevel, and we'll have to do this at some point probably, we can dissolve things like that as needed so we can down-res our meshes without actually decimating our or destroying our UMAP seams and stuff like that. So we can have some kind of predictability here. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of ways to optimize mesh later on. But that's why I wanted to talk about destructive versus non-destructive modeling versus sub-D and all that other fun stuff. A lot of you guys get confused by this kind of thing. It's one of those things that you're going to have to play around with, and you'll probably end up using all of them, probably, more than likely. And the reason being is that as great as it is to model non-destructively, at some point you're going to probably have to UV map things, and if you're using bevel modifiers or you have other things going on, a bunch of Booleans, you're not going to be able to do it that easily without applying everything. So it can be interesting because a lot of times you might make what's considered like a mid-poly model, and you could take it up to be a super detailed high poly model and then work it back to be a low poly. That's the way I personally like to work, but you could go straight to a full high poly model and then try to figure out how to turn that high poly model into a low poly later on, including doing things like retopo or just maybe like modeling low poly mesh on top of it that matches really closely. Things like that can happen, but generally speaking, some game objects, you don't even really need to do all that. It doesn't really matter that much because if you take a look here, we're going to actually take this back down to a one segment like so. Okay, so this isn't an ideal situation with these little triangles here, perhaps. We're going to apply this. And I want to show you something. Even with that triangle, we can add a weighted normal modifier. Okay. The weighted normal modifier, normally you'll see a lot of guys that check keep sharp, hard ops by default. When you apply a weighted normal modifier, we'll check keep sharp. You actually don't want this if you're going to end up baking. Okay. Like if you're doing high polys to low polys, or even if you're making game models and you're baking your own model, the low poly here to itself, a lot of times that'll mess it up. All right. You'll get ray misses in Substance Painter and Blender. It's pretty messy. So the thing here is that when we apply that weighted normal modifier, you can see the before, you can see the after here. It looks pretty good, but it's still got a little bit weirdness kind of stuff going on here in the corner, and that's what we're talking about with that single vertex being like that. We press Control B and then V. We do something like this. We can dissolve this edge. X is the delete and dissolve menu, but if you hit Control X, you can dissolve something like that, and so now you can see something like that going on. All right. Now this is every mesh is triangulated at the end of the day, right? So that's the way it's triangulated. That's why the shading doesn't change. If I triangulate it the other way, I might do something like that. Okay. And sometimes this mesh, or sometimes these areas like this, they will have bad shading um, until you do something nearby on it as well. You might have a little bit of a problem with something like this. So when you do that, it might actually clean it up. It might fix it. It might not. Okay. Sometimes you have to play with the weighted normal and see if you can't balance things out a little bit better. In this case, nothing's working that well. This brings us over to the shading topic once again. So we delete the weighted normal modifier. We see what's going on. All right, here's what's going on under the hood. If we go to this menu, this drop down, in edit mode, we get all these additional options. This is the one we're looking for. These are your split normals. Okay, and this controls your shading. And you can see here, if we go to object mode, right click, shade it smooth, as it is right now, this is what it looks like. Okay, if it was shaded flat, this is what it looks like. It splits them up, right? And if we shade this auto smooth, shade it auto smooth, and then add a weighted normal modifier, okay, we can see we got back to this result here. We're going to apply this because it won't show up until we apply it. So I'm using an add-on here called modifier list, but just hover over your modifier, Control A, and it will apply it. Okay, and otherwise you hit the check mark with that add-on. And so this is what we can see here, right? And so what it's done is it's more or less straightened these normals out quite a bit, okay? And these ones are not straightened out as much as they probably could be or should be. So they're actually technically wrong because you can see it's kind of doing this weirdness here. They're just slightly off. You can actually adjust these things manually, believe it or not. And you can adjust them even more with a weighted normal modifier. But let's just go ahead and play around with this. So if I press Alt-N on this face, and we can go to average by face area, you see nothing changes because weighted normals are basically averaged by face area. That's what they're doing. And so, but we can do things like grab this vertex, Alt-N, and we can click rotate, and we should be able to rotate this normal. You see, we can kind of straighten that out if we needed to. You can Alt N and click rotate again. You can see we're grabbing both of those. You'll see there. See that? It's even kind of split up. Oh, never mind. Sorry, that was the one. All right, so we can actually run this out a little bit like this, try to straighten it up as much as we can, and eventually we can work out our shading issues is all I'm trying to point out here. This can take a little while though, and it gets annoying. Okay, so subdivision workflow involves creating proper topology, all right, with quads generally speaking, but not always. Not always the case. You can use triangles, you can use n-gons, it just depends on how they subdivide. But something this low poly with a chamfer, although this doesn't look absolutely perfect, that's probably about as good as that's going to get. You could keep these as a triangle if you really wanted to, but it still looks a little bit off and kind of funny. All right, so this is where it gets fun. What we've done now, because we modified these normals, we've created custom normals. So if we go to our object data properties, we go down to geometry tab, you'll see you actually have to clear this before you can use auto smooth again. So we're going to go ahead and clear it. Okay, we're going to check on auto smooth. And under normals, you'll see we have the auto smooth option. Cool. And so if we go back and we use a weighted normal modifier, do this number. Okay, got this going on. Bevel that vertex again. Dissolve here. Okay. Now this is where it gets fun because weighted normals, while we could check keep sharp, it's not going to be ideal, like I was mentioning earlier. So we can use face influence though. And face influence is interesting because we could take a face like this and press Alt N, or maybe like take all of these here. And we can press Alt N, and we can go ahead and set the face strength to weak perhaps. Right? We can do things like that. So if I select all of this, set it all weak, right, and select these ones, should be able to set the strength here to strong. Okay, so I might tighten that up a little bit better. Still a little bit of a weird result here. I usually don't get that, but fun times, right? When they're always throwing curveballs. Anyways, so with that in mind, you see it tightened it up just maybe a little bit. So those kind of things can come into play. So keep in mind, you can use face strengths. This is something you might want to do because it's just going to, and it should have, by setting those strengths, weak and strong, yeah, you see that it straightened all of those out by doing that, right? So we don't have to go in there and rotate them and do all that nonsense, which is good. All right, so these kinds of things might be really confusing to you. That's okay. That's just because nobody talks about it for the most part in their tutorials. So I wanted to start with that. Now, we're going to go ahead and clear that data. Those are now considered custom normals because we applied the weighted normal modifier. We can add it back. You just add it, check face influence. We can mark all of this however we see fit. Personally, I am not liking what's going on there, so I'm going to select these two, and if I X dissolve vertices, it should go back flat. Okay, and personally, I will take these, and although we can use modifiers, I do prefer just doing a manual chamfer or something like this. So press Control B, you can bevel, use a segment of 1, you get a result like this. Even though that did have that little error in it, it still does. It's much, much smaller now, and it's not that big of a deal. If you needed a big curve for whatever reason, you know, it's going to be much better to come through here and do a number like this, right? Probably, more than likely. And this section here, this can be a little bit difficult as well because maybe we want to bevel this thing and we can't now. So vanilla Blender, like I was saying, it's as good as it is. Sometimes you need flexibility and you just don't have it with the default tools. I don't even know if 3D Studio Max can do this or not. I imagine they could, at least with an add-on, but I want to bevel like this corner, for example, or unchamfer it. So Mesh Machine, paid add-on. This is one I will recommend 2 add-ons. Machine Tools Deus Ex, paid version. Mesh Machine, paid version. Those are the first 2 add-ons you should get, followed by whatever else you can imagine. Hard Ops, Box Cutter, Kit Ops, and other things like that. Anything that's free as well you can get and just download and install. Perfectly acceptable. That. So what Mesh Machine will do is let you unbevel things. Okay. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's kind of iffy, or unchamfer, should I say. Unchamfer will work in this case. There are times it won't work out too well for whatever reason. Some mesh is just difficult, but you get the idea. We can unchamfer that like so. Like we'd have to more or less chamfer that, maybe chamfer this. And this add-on, what it basically lets us do is do an operation called fuse. It's like something like beveling. It's not quite the same, but we can certainly do that here, and then we can do that over here as well. We can sort of semi-destructively model. It's just like I was saying, if you were to model using non-destructive methods, uh, doing parametric modeling, things like that, the thing is that at some point you have to collapse it down anyways. And so being able to go through and use tools like this and do things destructively but have a little bit more flexibility, super important in my opinion. All right. But this is where it gets fun because now we can combine all that knowledge together. We'll turn off those normals real quick. We can just start going to town here. So you want to create like desks and things like that, right? Maybe tabletops, whatever the case. So we can do the bevel modifier, and we can manually do this every time. This is where hard ops comes into play. If you press Q for the menu, you can bevel. All right, you can see it's already set up for us right here. Angle, this, all that fun stuff, right? It's all pre-configured basically. Okay, and so there we go. We're pretty much on our way. We can also use things like weighted bevels, and you press the N key anytime you're editing, right? You can actually choose a bevel weight. So this is what we're going to play with real quick. This is kind of a non-destructive way of beveling of sorts. And so we have a maximum here that we set with the offset. Okay, but if I increase the bevel weight, you'll see we can actually bevel corners at different ratios here. And so we can play around with the that kind of setup there if we needed to. That might be something you want to do. It's not what I'm going to be doing in this video, but I just wanted to point it out. Okay, and so we're going to go ahead and add a bevel modifier again. So this is pretty standard right here. It comes in at 3. You really want an even number here, so you can down res it later on as needed. And then that's that. So another thing you could do is like using machine tools. You can take a face, for example. Normally you would press Shift D, right click, P, separate selection, go to object mode, select it, go back into edit mode, and now you can actually utilize this potentially. Might be a little bit of a faster way of doing this by pressing Shift D, right clicking, P, separate selection, and then hitting Alt Q. Yeah, there we go. I think we got it. Did we get it? Okay, yeah. Alt Q will let you switch to another object while in edit mode, which is pretty nice. Seems like a lot of little extra steps though. So if you set up those shortcuts the way I had them for basically the smart face, I think. So you can actually, or control 4 in my case, and you can actually select the face you want to work on. You hit control 4 or 4, and then it just separates it, duplicates it, separates it, and turns it into a new object, takes you into edit mode for it right away. So mesh from faces basically is what that is. So this just allows us to, basically I'm going to hit Alt Z to turn on X-ray. But now we can basically come in here and just start grabbing edges, pushing it into place. Maybe we want to grab the whole face and, bring it down a little bit. Press E, extrude it down on Z. So these kinds of table things work, right? Like this. Sometimes when you extrude, if you don't go up, you go down, it ends up inverting the normals. That's a pretty common thing. If you don't see normals that are backwards, what I like to use is backface culling. Some guys use other things, but to me, backface culling is the way to go. It just helps me visualize what's going on. And so when you take something into a game engine, if the normals are backwards, well, you guessed it, they're going to appear backwards in the game engine more than likely. Also, there are things such as face normals, vertex normals, all that other fun stuff, right? And so you can see they're all backwards right now. The vertex normals are pointing inwards, the faces are pointing inwards. And so when we select all this by hitting A, Alt N, and we want to just basically flip it. And then so we can flip it. But we can do things like recalculate outside or inside. And so we flip them around and you can see the normals flip. Okay? That's all that's going on there basically. Very useful feature and tool. So we can make things like this super fast. You'll notice our origin point is way over here in La La Land. It's just doing whatever it wants. If I want it here at the bottom of this, you can do this with Vanilla Blender. Let's turn those back off. Oh, you know what? Let's talk about them real quick. We'll talk about we'll place the origin point here in a second. these have normals as well. So like an edge will average between the two vertices, so you'll get a normal. So if I hit Alt S, I can scale out on my, right? I can do things like that. Faces have normals, so if you, let's kind of visualize this a little bit differently. Let's use the move tool. And I'm going to quickly chamfer this edge here real quick. All right, you see how that new face has a normal as well? Okay. And so with the move tool, you can see it's up and down, left and right, forward and backwards. It's lining up to the world, basically the world origin or the global transform, I say. We can use other things such as normals. Okay, and when we switch to normal, we can actually move on that normal, right? We can do things like that. Okay. Sometimes we have multiple selections. When you shift click, right, you have multiple selections. It'll average between the two's normals. See how that's going on? So sometimes you might want to use instead the active element, which is whatever's highlighted, and that will be your active element. So you can use that instead. I'll use a normal still and moving the whole group together. So you can basic. All right. Now, one last touch here, since there's really, I mean, you might use some of the others, but global, local, and normal is really the only ones you're going to end up using. Your objects, when you create them, generally speaking, they come in at with a rotation of 0, 0, 0, right? But if you rotate something in object mode, you'll see that it gets positioned like so. So we already know that if we, well, we're actually going to have to place the origin first because our origin point's low. So let's go ahead and Control Z back anyways to get back here. We're going to place the origin point down here. So Shift S, normally you can do cursor to selected in Vanilla Blender. Okay, and then you can go back into object mode, set origin to the 3D cursor. That's generally what you can do. And with machine tools, you can just quickly press Shift S and then do to vert or to face, whatever the case may be. You don't always have to use the cursor. And it'll move it while you're in edit mode too, which is real nice. All right. And so with that position back over here, you can see it actually with machine tools, it adopts the rotational values of things as well. So you need to be careful with that. A lot of times you have to hold Alt and then click on it. Okay. It's going to kind of, if you hover, you'll see the little tips there, right? On what you can do. You can hold Alt or Control in that case. But we're going to actually Control A, apply rotation and scale real quick. Just want to prove a point here is that if we rotate this, so if I rotate it on X, RX, start rotating, you'll see we get a rotational value, okay? But we're using global transformation right now, okay? We already know what the normal does, but we can also use local. And that is affected by the rotation of the origin here, basically. So if that has been rotated in object mode and you have a rotational value, your local coordinates will work like such, okay? Very simple. You have the pie menu that comes, or machine tools will let you change things very quickly. So you can use global, you can use active element, and you see active element uses active and local. All right, you can do individual, which uses individual and local, right, and then local again, right, medium point local. So you have these different options. You can also use the 3D cursor, so you can place that wherever. And that global and active are going to be your primaries. More than likely, sometimes you'll turn on normal, which is real nice. So very quick to get to that now, right? You can also do this with snapping. You notice I told you to turn on absolute grid snapping, or I turn it on at least. There's a reason, because when you're working with modular kits, you really want this option available to you. But we can also do vertex snapping or edge snapping super fast, and we don't have to go up here and fiddle around with this stuff no more. We can also backspace here. That will reset that. Good to go, right? And so when we have something like this, we just place the origin point real quick. You can see I held Alt. It stays at 0 instead of adopting rotational values. And we can do things like that. So machine tools, if I want to mirror this, I can shift click, right? This is the active element, Alt, and I think it's Control X. I set it to Alt X. But this is the new kind of mirroring tool that machine tools has. You have to use this if you have hard ops. You might want to overwrite the shortcuts of hard ops, but this is way fast to do mirrors basically. And so if I do this right now, it's going to mirror in this direction. We can also tag X, and you'll see that because this is in the center of this tabletop or whatever, we now have legs in every corner, and it's just a mirror, which means we can come in here. We can turn those normals off now that we understand them. It means we can just come in here and start modeling. So if we grab, we do a loop cut, Control R, select faces, hold Alt, click, hit inset, and hold Control. So I to inset by default. you'll get this kind of number going on. You can do things like that. You can push in, but you might have some leftovers down here. In that case, you can just select another face, and you can do this number. It might push it up a little bit though, so you can see the origin point's down there. But generally speaking, it works out fairly well. It's easy to change the origin point. It's not easy to fix the other error we had necessarily. I mean, it's not too hard, but it's better to just kind of avoid it if possible, right? Okay, so we can do all these kinds of things. It's a lot of fun. Here's the fun part about all this, is that when you are using a bevel modifier, a lot of times, like if you do a chamfer, you'll see it's actually still beveling one of these corners. It may be something you want, maybe something you don't want. You might want it to end in this kind of topology. You may not want it to end in that kind of topology. So you have options available here to you. You do a chamfer and then you bevel this. If you keep the resolution high enough, you can see that it's actually going to give us that kind of a result there. So the order that you bevel different faces, like sometimes you might want to start with the top and then go to the sides. Maybe you want to do the sides first and then go to the top. That does matter. Okay, it will actually kind of influence how your bevels take place anyway. So just keep that in mind. But now we're kind of in this good position where we have semi-destructive workflow. Okay, like it's not all destructive, but it's semi-destructive, and so we can adjust things like this bevel still, not have any problems. But if we did ever have an issue here with vanilla blender, right, this is going to be a little bit of a problem with mesh machine. We just refuse this, and you can see we hit W, that number. We can tweak these and adjust these later on if needed, or unbevel them or chamfer them. So this is why I highly recommend getting these add-ons, right? It's going to help you out tremendously, especially mesh machine and edit mode. One of my favorite features by far are origin points in the middle of this object. And so just like we use the mirror tool for mirroring these legs, when you're in edit mode, it's a destructive mirror, but you can just symmetrize things super fast and it's going to bisect it automatically. So just click it over and blam, it's done. It's bisected it down the middle. It doesn't look like much has happened here or occurred, but let's say I was making some bigger edits over here. Let's say I was doing this manually and I did an inset, something like that. So I do 2 loop cuts and an inset. Let's say I do a bevel here. And so for this bevel, maybe I want to customize it a little bit. So I use a custom bevel. It'd be a little bit hard to see what's going on here because the bevels are in the way, but we can adjust this manually basically at this point, kind of create some curvatures and things like that. We can bump up the segment count to like 8, create a little section in here like this. So it may or may not be looking good right now. We're going to have to figure that out in a second. More than likely this bevel here is actually still trying to bevel those areas for whatever reason, but it is doing that. So we can now come in here though, bevel this corner, maybe we turn it back to a super ellipse. All right, maybe we'll take this, and because this is a mirror across this origin point here, we can actually move it, G and Shift Z, just move them in a little bit, get this going on. And now you can start to see what's taking effect here. Get a lot of result out of this rather quickly. This is going to be like this. Maybe this will be a little bit less or something like that. Okay, it's beveling all the way up to this edge here. Okay, that was our symmetry line basically. So when I do the Alt X now, symmetrize that way, and then Alt X symmetrize that way, this is what we get. You can see we got some weird shading going on. This may or may not be completely flat. You can always press S and Z and try to flatten it. You can also use loop tools. You can flatten it, but you can also add a weighted normal modifier because that's probably what's causing the problems right now. Uncheck keep sharp so we can make sure that everything's shading correctly. If it's not going to shade correctly with unchecked keep sharp, there's a good odd chance you need to do or add more geometry. In this case, you can see it still isn't shading correctly, and that's because this edge, we did really good with it. Also, Mesh Machine, if you click an edge and hold Alt and click, it does an additional selection here with an angle of 60. It's actually really good for Boolean and work. But if we press Control B, you can do a chamfer here. Okay, and you need at least a chamfer to hold correct shading on a lot of stuff, but you'll see that that chamfer now actually has influenced this in a pretty good manner. Okay, and so no matter how hard you try, when you are doing a Boolean Ngon workflow and you're using faces in such a manner, It's always going to have some weird results sometimes. It's not always perfect. It's not such a bad thing for a lot of game models. It doesn't, like if you're doing a large environment set, this stuff, it really isn't going to matter at the end of the day. Most people won't notice it or recognize it, but it does, in fact, have some weird things going on because of the topology. So like things like right here, might want to use the alignment pie and do an Alt A, align right. Might want to flatten that out a bit. Alt A, align left. There's a free add-on called Set Flow. We're going to try to use it in here. I don't know if it's going to work out, but we can select loops by holding Alt and Shift and selecting around like that. Okay, and the Set Flow add-on, we're going to click it by right-clicking Set Flow. This add-on's free, by the way. You can get it. And so it didn't work. I have to go to Object Mode, select the object, go back into Edit Mode, right-click Set Flow. Okay, and sometimes that'll make things a little bit nicer. Sometimes it doesn't. But there's little things like that that you can do that probably don't see in any other videos, right? So that's something extremely useful. I think the only other video that even mentions that add-on is Rumus, right? Rumus 3D. So Legend, of course. Anyways, Alt X, flip over. Alt X, flip over. There we go. So that is that. Now this over here is beveled, cool. And but we could tweak it or do whatever we want. Now let's do real quick. We're gonna turn the bevel off. You could just leave it and just turn it off like that. / we can isolate. Sometimes you don't want to see things while you're editing a mesh, so we'll turn a little tab here off. It's going to turn off in edit mode, and I'll turn that one as well. So it comes back later on. Alt middle click will actually focus on a certain, whatever's under your mouse basically. Kind of move around in that manner. What we want to do here is add a loop cut and add a loop cut. So this is a square right now. This is going to be one of those other cool features of loop tools. If we do a select loops boundary loop, we can select like that, right? So just pay attention to that because I'm going to select there. Okay, select here, boundary loop. That's it. And then I'm going to Alt Shift click, select there, Alt Shift click, select there. All right. And with those selected like that, I can right click, use loop tools, and do a circle. So we can turn a square into a circle, basically. All right. Now this is still being chamfered or beveled in this case, and maybe we need more faces, more geometry. So we can add loop cuts, right? And we can do the same thing basically, and it's not really that big of a. Sometimes it freaks out and it wigs out. You'll have to find out that's going to occur by doing. You can see I selected that loop in there instead this time, but loop tools, circle. You can also use set flow if you really wanted to, but in this case, loop tools just happens to work out pretty well. So now this will be at this resolution, right? So you can do things like that. Also, something kind of interesting is if you select one edge and then do a ring selection. So select loops, rings. Oh, for me, it's on my mouse basically. But I could select this ring selection like this. I can press Q, quick favorites. This is set to quick favorites. It's check or deselect right here. Okay. Check or deselect. It selects every other. You can actually adjust it and how it selects over here. But it does something like this. Okay. And because of that, I can now use select loops. And it can select all the way through like so. In this case, it might not be actually what I want to use because it's selecting the cross section here in the middle. That may or may not be something you want. It just depends. So if I do this and I check or deselect, and I don't want it to cross through the exact center piece, I can always do a offset of 1. Now it's going to select these ones. And so when I select loops now, we get the other ones. I can hit Control X and dissolve it. That's only going to work really well with quads, and as long as you don't have any other details on the sides here for the most part. Otherwise, you'll have to do a little bit of adjustment. So I'm going to undo all that back. For the bevel here, we don't need necessarily 4 segments. We could do 1 and adjust the amount here. You'll see that once we do that, it does look a little bit goofy. We have to apply a weighted normal and check keep sharp. There you go. Okay, you can see where hard ops and box cutter and everything kind of helps out. It's not that the add-ons are really that complicated. They do things underneath the hood of Blender. Basically, they're using Blender's features, and they're just doing a bunch of things for you already. So like pre-configs. That's really what it is. And it's useful. It's kind of things that you wish you could change manually by default anyways, but you can't, unfortunately. So Now that, well, there's an add-on at least for it, so you have somebody doing that kind of work for you. And so we can weight that normal as well, uncheck keep sharp. You'll see that shading under there is pretty rough. And then once again, um, sometimes like selecting, if you hold control and shift, you can select quad selections. In this case, these n-gons don't do that. We can use the cursor selector instead. And so I can do boundary selection, I can do a chamfer, all that fun stuff like that, right? Maybe here, chamfer. Usually sharp edges, you want to add some kind of chamfer to it. It's just going to help it. It's going to help it, basically. Do a quick mirror across it again, so it all matches up and nice and neat. So that way when it bakes out, it'll bake really well. Right? So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Like, this is what this video was about, was just working with these kinds of tools, because once you understand this kind of stuff, you know, trying to make furniture or basic 3D models without it is pretty rough, right? So if I was to place all this back at the center, let's go back to the world origin for the 3D cursor. I can use absolute grid snapping. I can go to edit mode, snap up. We can work with this kind of fast. This kind of stuff, you know, really shouldn't take all that long now. Another thing that is really helpful as a beginner, a lot of times you don't have the dimensions of your objects you're trying to make. Find a character reference of some sort. I have my own, but you could use like the Unreal Engine one or Unity's or whatever the case may be. Use these as your scale references for your objects you're creating. Extremely important because you can eyeball things to those characters and usually line up with the game environment more. Real world scales don't translate over to game environments very well. Usually, not always, but usually doesn't. And so you think about that as you're working on the model because we need to make maybe like a desk or something like that. And there's all kinds of little additional tools that help out along the way. So we can use bool tools as well. So I'm going to create another cube. So we can do this like semi non-destructively again or non-destructively. So using bool tools, we select, Control Shift B. We can do a brush Boolean difference. This is going to be a modifier, just like if you're using hard ops for the most part, except it uses the exact method. You want to use fast as much as possible because what's going to happen is exact's going to start to slow you down. But you can see this is a live Boolean, so it just keeps going. And so you can use the other methods as well. So difference to subtract things, unions to add them together, intersects will basically, the cross section will become, yeah, trying to think of the word. I can't even think of it right now. And then slicing as well, quite useful. So, but like you're making a tabletop or a desk or whatever the case may be, you know, this is a combination of all these tools together. You can see like we can get some things going. Alt click, hold control while insetting. Also, pro tip here, if you take under face, inset faces, if you assign it to W, you won't be able to use the select box no more by using the W key. But I don't use circle or lasso's got a shortcut for it. I'll show you here in a sec. But I only use select box for the most part and sometimes lasso. I don't use the circle one because C is the circle selector like this, right? Cursor selector, circle, something like that anyways. So if you wanted to do the box, you just have it selected already. You can still do the box, no problem. If you had a box cutter on, of course you would be drawing a box. So usually you want to turn box cutter off as much as possible. Like when you're not using it, turn it off. It's going to cause problems. But if I wanted to use that lasso selector, it's control right click. Use the lasso selector that way. So if you want to just like circle something, see, but you don't need that necessarily up here. Unless tweak, I think is pointless personally, but select circle doesn't seem to work well. So just leave it at select box. There you go. You can do whatever you need to do, right? So we can also do those boundary selections. Control X to quick dissolve. Don't always have to have faces. So you can see I'm having a hard time selecting that one for some reason. Alt click, Alt Shift, Control X, bam. Now we are in progress here. This has already been used for a Boolean, basically. So that's kind of a problem, but not really. We can move it over here, scale it in. Can go into edit mode, hit Alt Z, do this number, do this number. All kinds of fun stuff to do like this. And we could use it as a Boolean object again, even though it's set to wireframe right now. We can do the difference real quick and fast. You can see it's still there, right? So if we were to duplicate this, it does the same thing over again. We can, however, use things like arrays. Okay. In this case, we're going to do array, move it down, do that number. We can change the number here. Things like that can be quite useful. And this is what the magic of hard ops is really about. It's that you don't have to do all of this like that. You can press Q, and so we can bevel. We can add the weighted normal by holding Alt and click and sharpen. But we can also do arrays super fast, so you can just pretty much hit Z or excuse me, hit X, hit it twice maybe, mouse wheel up, mouse wheel down. It's just like an extension of Blender basically, and that's what makes it so good and why so many guys use it. And I just want to point that out, so you definitely should consider doing that. It's not meant to be. There's a learning curve to it, but it's not meant to be scary. It's meant to improve your workflow basically. Because coming over here, typing 0 and then doing this or -1, it already does all that for you instead of having to negative whatever. And so that works out quite well. This just digs a hole into here. So this isn't how I personally prefer to do it. I do a lot more destructive stuff, generally speaking. But you could take something like this, for example, duplicate it, and you could try to undo all of the effects on it. So you Shift D, right click to duplicate it, but it's set viewport display to, in this case, wire. We go back to textured. You'll see we have an object again, which is nice. I don't think it's changed too much other stuff. Sometimes under custom properties, you can see, yeah, Bool Tool brush and Bool Tool transform. Could probably get rid of that stuff as well. So there might be a few other things that are created. I don't know, under object data properties. Maybe there's some, I was thinking maybe like some vertex groups or something, but it doesn't appear to be so, right? So with that in mind, we can / isolate it. We only have to work on the top one because, well, bottom one is, guessed it, it's there. Personally, I don't want to do this yet. Let's go back a sec. Let's /. I'm going to hit Alt S and scale everything in along normals. Okay, we can see we got something still going. Oh, that's the Boolean object. Let's do this number real quick. Push it in a little. And let's take this face. I'm going to line it up to about there. Okay, just like if it was a real drawer. We're going to extrude this out a little bit. / now. We can grab a section like this. If we try to inset this, you'll see it comes in like this. The real drawers, generally speaking, they have like a piece of wood here that's screwed into this piece of wood. So we might want to do something a little bit different. Loop cut, bevel. Okay. And then so we might be able to add a loop cut down here as well. And now we can just extrude this down, right? Little things like that. You can see the edge there. Might not want to go past that. Right there. Maybe that was the grid line. Anyway, so we got that going on. Maybe these are a little bit thicker, so we'll undo that. / we're going to inset and hold control. That's going to basically more or less do an extrude along normals. And so we can do things like that, right? And you guessed it, it's pretty much good to go, except I want to dissolve as much of this as possible. I want to press X, do a limited dissolve, change this to 0.05. And there we go. We can see it got rid of all those extra edges, and that's something you might want to do sometimes when you're doing Boolean ingon workflows. It just kind of kills off a lot of the extras real quick, right? And this can allow things to happen a little bit easier, such as using a bevel modifier. In this case, we're using the bevel, and we can do this number. Hit / you can see it lines up right there. Okay. Move it forward a little bit. And so what's interesting about hard ops is also when you click bevel again, it doesn't add a new bevel, it lets you adjust the old, right? So it's actually pretty good. But you do have to remember it comes in at 3. Probably want to set it to 4 or 2 or something else, generally speaking. Mesh Machine, on the other hand, I want to point this out because I ran into this problem a little bit earlier. Like if I did, let's say I did a chamfer here and I did a fuse, right? You see how the segments are at 5? You don't use even numbers here, use odd numbers because it's already got one segment basically. So it starts at 0 with the add-on. So 1 would be what you want, 3. It's actually kind of backwards, but that's what it is, right? And so we'll undo that one. Bevel modifier real quick. I'll spool it up once. At 4 already. Okay. Shade auto smooth. Weighted normal. Take that and uncheck keep sharp. There we go. So now you can see we can start to do this to a lot of things relatively fast. It's not really that bad. We can weight the normal here. Uncheck keep sharp with hard ops. I'll weight it to normal. Uncheck keep sharp. There we go. And you can see where it's starting to work out as. When you're using hard ops and you're doing booleans, it actually creates a cutters folder, same thing as if you're using box cutter. So it keeps it nice and neat and organized. You don't have to worry about certain things like these being kind of lost in all of this mess here. But this is exactly what you want when you're working. This is something that's kind of unique here because this is mirrored. We may want to go into edit mode, press Shift S, do cursor to selected, press Shift A, create a cube. It's way too large. Let's do 0.1. Okay, and you can see because it's mirrored, it goes down there as well. So you can work on multiple objects in edit mode, or you can create new objects in edit mode, and it'll be part of the same object. So we just can modify this one like super fast. What I like to do is just add a loop cut here. Select that backface, X, delete vertices. And so this is an open backface here, but it doesn't really matter usually. It depends. You might want to fill it, you might not. But I can do these kinds of things like this now super fast. No problems. Down maybe. Section like that. That's not really what I want though. Let's try it again. Let's bring this up like that. Extrude that out. Maybe some kind of just bulky wooden handle or something. And you can see it's already beveled as well. Shade auto smooth. Okay, in edit mode. Sure why right now. Okay, keep sharp. Okay, I guess I just had the weighted normal kind of hung up or something. Yeah, so this could be a tighter bevel. Okay, it's at 3. Let's change it to 4. Let's reweight the normal here. Check keep sharp and do that. See, we got a little bit of an issue now. Not sure exactly what happened here with this one. I guess that offset just went to. Okay, we'll move it back. Not a big deal. And sometimes you might want to just intersect things a little bit because we don't need a bevel here at the top. Later on, you can delete that kind of stuff when you make a model or optimize it or whatever the case may be. But it's pretty much what's going on. Don't forget you have box cutter. This is extremely useful, so you can turn on like dots, snap system, hold control. You can just do like a number like this. So if this was a desk and you need to punch a hole through it or something, you could do that. And in this case, it doesn't work too well because this big section is under here. But if I press Q and E with hard ops, I can actually mouse wheel through my different. You can even reorder them by holding Shift and reordering. You see in the bottom left, I can reorder where they're positioned. So you can push things in front of one or the other. But you can always make adjustments later on. Like if I want to cut this all the way through, I can do that. This here is having a Boolean of this object as well. Maybe I don't want that. I can go back and delete it. So it's only these ones affected now. Right? And so this is still non-destructive technically. This is still non-destructive because this Boolean here that took place here, we can actually just back. So maybe that's the little hole that you have in the back of the computer desk for wires and stuff. You can grab that shape and scale it S and Shift Z and get it going like whatever else. And you can, of course, create more detail to that if you needed to. In this case, I think it's a little bit janked up because of the here. This is why weighted normals can sometimes be useful because it can help stop things like this sometimes. Not always is that the case, and sometimes this like edge here that's being created is going kind of the wrong way. I might be better off just doing a K. Try this quick. You might want to just do like a loop cut down the middle, right? And that will stop maybe that one from occurring over there. Hide this by pressing H. Sometimes these relationship lines get really annoying, so you can turn them off. You might want to turn this back on as well at some point. So just keep in mind if you turn it on and off, it could be used at some other point. So just remember that, I guess. And once again, box cutter gets in the way a lot of times. Turn it off if possible. I don't use snapping a whole lot, to be honest. I prefer kind of going like at it freestyle almost. Not worried about snapping different parts of the object. So yeah, there we go. We've made a desk. We didn't need Manny the whole time. They actually have names on Real Engine ones. Manny and Quinn. Yes, they got names. Anyways, and so there we go. Now, if we wanted these all over here, we might want to do that later on. However, we could try to do a mirror here towards the end and see if that would work out. You can see it actually does. Probably after or before the weighted normal and before the bubble. Okay, so that actually worked out. These here can be mirrored across the desk surface probably. I usually try to use one object as the base where I mirror everything with that object. If it needs to go across it anyways, unless there's something else that needs to go across, but generally speaking. So at some point, like right now, obviously, if we pull out one drawer, they all come out, not probably ideal. You'll have to go through these and collapse them down. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. Hard ops, box cutter, they have like quick little apply methods. Personally, I don't really care to use them a whole lot. A lot of times I just convert to mesh. I might move my objects to a new collection, called desk or something. I don't know. And I'll just leave behind all the old stuff. And usually those are the cutters that are left over. So things like that. It's not too hard to work with, so we can delete them. But these should all now be, well, they're solid mesh right now. But anytime you have solid pieces of mesh that are multiple objects in one piece, you can always just select it all, hit P, and separate by loose parts. And it'll blow apart. Basically, explodes it apart. You can see. Now we can actually go through these. The origin points are all the same, unfortunately, but could just reassign the origin points super fast. Do this number. So this would be more or less a game object at this point, or pretty close to it. You'd have to unwrap it. You can unwrap it. You might want to delete additional cutters that you might have missed. Clean all this up nice and neat. You'll probably combine it back down to a solid shape later on, unless this needed to be an interactable prop, right? You might want to keep these as kind of like little separate objects that you can set up with blueprints and things like that, so that you can open and shut and things like that, or whatever you got to do in Unity with C# and all that. So anyway, so convert it to a mesh again. Why not? Delete cutters, delete original collection. You can start to name all of this stuff if we wanted to. But for the most part, that's about it for this video, I think. It's really just about, taking your time to figure out these kinds of things. Because, could technically had duplicated everything, increased the bevel counts, and then you could have had a high poly to bake onto a low poly. But for some game models, you really don't need nothing more than this. It doesn't have to be a nightmare scenario of trying to make everything absolutely pristine, perfect with a high poly and a low poly. It just depends on your game and what you're creating. So, for example, there are times and things that may come into effect here because a lot of times desks, of course, are made of different panel sections. In that case, you actually want to kind of model each panel section as if it was a real desk. And then you can bake onto a model that's something more like this. So you would create that high poly with all of its individual pieces, make sure they're airtight so the normals can cast onto the low poly. But at the end of all of it, you have to have a low poly that can cover it over and have at least chamfers on edges to hold shading, basically. You have to hold shading without using sharps. That's the big thing there, okay? If you have it like, say, if you have like a hard edge, but there's no UV seam on it, you don't necessarily have to chamfer it, but it'll have bad shading. It won't bake right. All right, so just keep that in mind. You really, really want to try to chamfer as many things as possible. If you do use sharps, you're going to have ray misses when it comes to baking. It gets messy. It's just a really tedious thing that you have to do with Blender, and that's what it is. Okay, so anyways, that's it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one. Tried to make it pretty informative for you new guys out there on how to do these kinds of things because they can be challenging, and they really shouldn't be. It's just about working with the tools. Okay, Blender doesn't have necessarily, well, Blender can do a lot of the stuff you probably want it to do, but it's kind of like a bunch of little workarounds for it almost. Uh, you really want to get these add-ons, machine tools, mesh machine. That's your primary ones there. Box cutter, hard ops, kit ops. We're gonna do some more kit ops stuff later on. I gotta make a kit and set that all up so I can just start kit bashing a bunch of stuff and show you guys how to do that with all of this in mind. This is a lot of stuff to remember already, but when you start throwing mesh on top of mesh and doing a bunch of booleans, it gets even more complicated, right? So anyways, that's it for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will check you out in the next one. All right, take care.